Hi, Mage fans. This is your host, Terry Robinson with Mage the Podcast, and today's episode is something I'm calling What We Lost, First Edition Mage. What We Lost may or may not become a series where I talk about the various loose threads in Mage that never seem to get followed up on, or that refer to things that were ultimately changed in canon. This is in part spurned by me reading the Mage 0th edition, the unreleased version of Mage that was reworked into First Edition, and as I read it, I was continually going, whoa, at things that simply never made it into the game. Were all of these things amazing? No. Some would have wildly changed the game if continued, some would have resulted in a much smaller version of the game, or a different possible constellation of metaplot choices that could flourish, but regardless, I thought they were interesting. So I figure I'd go through First Edition core and try to pick out the interesting tidbits that kind of got abandoned. Some didn't make it beyond First Edition, some were dropped within First Edition, and some were dropped immediately after this book. This episode does not assume that you've read 1E Core, and Adam is going to eventually do a new Tomes of Magic episode for First Edition, having read through the entire canon of Mage at this point. Additionally, Mage the Podcast has no favorite edition of Mage, and we recognize all of them as being perfectly valid. Adam tends to like 1E and 2E, I tend to like Revised and M20. I also contend that editions are not very unitary, or at least not as much as we'd wish. There are mentions in 1E Core that are contradicted literally by Book of Chantries, the next book that comes out. I argue that M20 is at least 2 editions, and Revised is probably 3 different ones, but that's for another episode. Lines have multiple developers over time, books have multiple authors, and there's only so much editors and developers can do to keep everything straight. So with that, let's draw ourselves back to the year 1993. Mage the Ascension core comes into a world where Vampire the Masquerade has been out for 2 years, and Werewolf the Apocalypse has been out for 1. Most of the World of Darkness is still undefined, and most of the other worlds are even more so undefined. The entirety of the direction we get is that the Near Umbra is like the memory of Earth, and the Deep Umbra and Dream Realms are weird places. The number for the 1E core rulebook for Mage is 4000, marking it as the first of the Mage line, with Vampire books being in the 2000 series and Werewolf being in the 3000 series. My favorite book number, of course, is 4999 for the book Ascension, what was intended to be the last Mage the Ascension book ever. So what's the first thing that strikes me about this book? Mystery. We see on the cover a book with a touch of gold foil limbing a tarot card showing the Mage. I had seen the tarot, or tarot as I probably called it at the time, in 8th grade, but it showed a subtle inversion of what I expected. The cover was a scan of Richard Thomas's daughter's flower girl dress from his wedding, and that purple velvet gave it a sense of being regal when combined with that touch of gold foil. At the time, I already had the core book for Vampire with its green marble. I had never seen Werewolf with its interesting rusted metal visage, so to me, regal marble to royal purple seemed appropriate for the next game I got to see. Thumbing through the illustrations inside, no two seemed to reference the same world or place. There was no character that appeared seemingly across multiple images. It wasn't a world of darkness as a cohesive whole, it was this disjointed thing where odd things happen and little could be expected in advance. Every illustration for each of the traditions radiated subtle power like the person depicted was capable of so much. The thing I'd like to bring back here is not being sure what to expect. We bring this back by stealing from other games and changing things up on our own. I would love, for instance, a book of alternative secret histories, where mundane and mortal history turns out largely the same, but maybe the magical one is different. Maybe in one, Marauder infiltration is what the traditionalists watch out for, rather than the Nephandi. Maybe Tremere became a vampire in 1400, and his sin wasn't revealed until after the Council of Nine starts and forms. What would it mean for the traditions to not have the Order of Hermes after vampirism is discovered amongst its ranks and it is ejected? Maybe the Hermetics leave and bog down the technocracy with astrology and alchemy without inventing astronomy and chemistry, and now the Ascension War ultimately starts in 1700 and comes to a head in the Victorian era. Maybe the cult of ecstasy falls for the rich pleasures of darkness, and the seat of time is taken by House Creamon, who predicted the whole thing, or by a disillusioned cabal of pure thought who takes the seat trying to travel back in time to prevent the corruption of the papacy due to coerced or infighting. Small historical events trickle forward and change everything, and suddenly the March of the Nine doesn't happen. And instead, the first group undertaking in the traditions is actually maybe trying to suppress a umbral monstrosity like a Nexus Crawler or some greater Malfian spirit. And the start of Mage tradition history is with an uneasy piece in place with the Garou. I'd love a supplement that would maybe come up with 10 of these as a 1 or 2 page starter and give us a normal mortal society, but either different traditions or a different council. Maybe the Nephandi realize that they're getting a raw deal, that they learn that their Dark Masters wish for their annihilation, something they never signed up for in their bid for power, and a band of rebel Nephandi are trying to stop the return of a Dark Lord while pulling against the tugs of their souls, almost like the Shadow and Wraith. So let's bring back some weird that can later be discovered in a game on a grand scale. The next thing we get in 1E Core is a sense that sleepers are more capable than what we think. The Prelude, not yet called that yet, introduces 2 things I thought were very interesting. One is the character Robert, a literal trenchcoat ninja, knows about magic and is on the crux of awakening. He can feel it and is aware of the supernatural world, and we get 2 terms: that he's not able to grasp the tapestry, and that he's not yet been pulled through. I like the idea that all mortals are capable of brief flashes of insight when they confront the supernatural. For instance, Robert isn't yet awakened, but can do a few simple things like has the awareness trait and maybe a few parlor trick equivalents, kind of like small static magic abilities. Maybe one of the things that helps maintain the secrecy of mages, or keeps mages on the down low, is that crazy supernatural stuff causes mortals to manifest strange things that aren't just paradox. Maybe you just did something vulgar in front of a cop. Their fury at you causes their bullets to literally light on fire, dealing aggravated damage. Did someone just see you do a flying roundhouse kick across rooftops? Maybe that person in response subconsciously locks every door in the building you're trying to escape through. Mortals may possess these faint sparks, as when you light a fire, it's often the case that if you don't have enough air and dry tinder, the kindling will merely get hot or create an ember, but not quite enough to get a true fire started. Maybe this is what happens with some mortals. Not quite sleepers anymore, but merely the attenuated, sleepwalkers or something similar. Maybe I'd propose a trichotomy of the asleep, the attenuated, and the awakened. We'll talk about this later when I discuss how magic develops, but mortals may get a taste for this and join a magical society or try and learn sorcery to recapture it. Maybe this is a supply line for the Nephandi. Mortals that are attenuated may sell their souls or make hideous promises after getting a glimpse of the power of the spheres, giving into the demonic masters to taste that moment of ability and capability. Some sleepers will become attenuated for longer and more powerfully than others with the hope that they will eventually properly awaken. This could be one of the signs that mage groups use when they're trying to recruit new members. Next in the introduction, in this opening fiction, we get weird paradox manifestations. For instance, each time Madame Woe does something vulgar, it produces a gray snake that she keeps in a tank. She says she has something planned for them. Ultimately, this backfires, and a giant snake monster appears. But this suggests 3 things I like. 1, every time a character does something vulgar, they get one more reminder of that, or something similar. Maybe another bluehead fly follows them around, or another lunar moth tries to distract them. Maybe if they keep these creatures alive and safe, they don't get affected by paradox just yet. These are now paradox tokens. Maybe they get another debt collector that calls them each week that they need to spend 20 minutes on the phone placating. These are kind of persistent emblems of paradox that can be detected by others who know what they're looking for. Maybe you detect this kind of anti-quintessence form in a fight, and instead of trying to directly engage the opposing mage, you deliver a set of blows to the set of beeping pagers they've been accumulating over the course of combat that seem to keep going off, and with their destruction, a paradox backlash is triggered. This leads into the idea in 1E that paradox spirits are a thing that can literally be negotiated with. Now, accumulating a paradox flaw is a literal negotiation. Your syndicate mage's paradox takes the form of credit cards that never have available credit, but every time they want to buy something, they have to suffer the indignity of using each one in person once a week, or the paradox hammer comes falling down on them. So they take 5 of these cards, insert them into an ATM nearby. The screen says connecting, and on that little black and green display, a very well-dressed lady with a severe bun asks them how they wish to address their overdue account. From here, they negotiate, and it may involve stopping another mage tampering with the money supply, forgoing access to their resources background while their accounts are corrected, or maybe they lose their fingerprints temporarily, which vastly complicates their access within their technocratic construct. A money-inclined follower with the same paradox manifestation needs to burn them at an altar, whereby a kitschy Polly Pocket figurine she uses comes alive to do the negotiation. She has the choice of destroying a counterfeiting operation, not having access to the color black for her wardrobe for 2 months, or burning down a particular bank with marauder ties. I wouldn't allow characters to generally roll for this negotiation, as I don't want manipulate to become a trait that allows you to bleed off paradox, but it may come in use later to allay concerns about the totality of the arson the Hollower agreed to commit when they again meet up again with the paradox spirit. These paradox tokens could become powerful sympathetic connections to the original mage. Maybe after a certain period of time of handling someone else's paradox token, it becomes yours. If each point of paradox results in a very hard to keep alive African violet to spring up nearby, which your foe collects, they now have something equivalent to a hair sample or a piece of clothing, or your social security number, for the purposes of connection and sympathy for correspondence magic. But once used or once retained for a certain period of time, it is now theirs, and if they don't keep that African violet alive, they'll suffer backlash. This now becomes a balancing game of how many connections do you feel you can manage. The last thing that this gives me is an idea that if you can safely accumulate enough paradox totems or paradox tokens, you can do something with them. Maybe creating wonders can be done with these little tokens. I may need 7 of the flickering light bulbs that slowly replace the normal ones in my chantry to create a wonder I'm calling the Master Switch, which can be placed against any wall to activate or deactivate anything plugged in nearby. If I succeed in creating it, the 7 paradox is transferred to the wonder and slowly bleeds off. This also provides an idea of what bleeding off paradox could then look like. Maybe once a week, one of those 7 light bulbs flickers a particular amount, and I know it's the one that I need to eat a la David Blaine magic trick. Or maybe I need to release one of the paradox roaches that's been following me into another abandoned home once a week to get rid of it. There may be other uses for these items, but these are the ones I could come up with. Spirits may find them particularly tasty and may demand them as part of chiminage, consuming them as though familiar, or to suddenly always know where a mage is, having a strong sympathetic connection to them now. Those collected from a marauder shedding their paradox may bear strange markings or glow in the presence of the appropriate marauder. And these are all just ideas from the prelude. Moving on to the introduction, the Lexicon brings a few terms that I don't think we get later in the future, or at least not in the same way. For instance, here's one that changed. Deacon isn't just someone in charge of a chantry, as it is in later editions, but its founder. This one makes sense in a world where a chantry requires a node, and nodes are rare, or at least those that can support a chantry are rare. Deacon becomes a title, as opposed to a position. Deacon Errant could be in reference to someone from a destroyed chantry. Apex Deacon or Master Deacon may have been involved in founding an ancestral chantry, one of the main chantries associated with the tradition. We get 2 other terms that I would love to bring back. One is the continuum, which is the term for all mages. To me, this creates a kind of fellowship where all mages recognize that they're kind of part of the same thing. The Mad Marauder and the Fallen Nephandist are both members of the continuum along with the orphan, traditionalist, and the technocrat. This could be a vague organizing principle for mages, or it could be the basis for political blocks. Some want the Awakened to move entirely across the gauntlet, to be free of mortal confounding. Others may want to awaken as many as possible. The other term is the curtain, for the mundane reality that most mortals believe in. It's another term for the consensus, but to me has a different implication because it suggests that the control is active and something is being hidden. A consensus is built while a curtain is held around you. Another one to note is Shard Realm, listed as, quote, one of the 9 realms created by Gaia, each ruled by a Celestine, roughly aligned to planets and Luna, end quote. I bring this up because the Shard Realms have never been particularly well explained. This clarifies nothing, but I have thoughts. Chapter 2 introduces us to the milieu of the game, and the idea that the rich are richer and the poor are poorer. Houses are smaller, mansions are bigger, buildings tend towards the Gothic and crusty. Every church looks like a cathedral. This is interesting to me, as it suggests physical changes to the world. In M20, we don't get this idea as much, and maybe I want a city clad in gargoyles with Corinthian columns, and Doric friezes. Also, we get the idea that the Awakened hold themselves responsible for the darkness in the world. This includes the technocracy. They think the current order is everyone else's fault. The technocracy sees the traditions as disruptive forces, inviting the Nephandi in, holding back the clockwork future, which will sweep away the worm, which has been causing the clock to wind down. The traditions see the technocracy as stifling wonder and innovation. The Marauders see the traditions as having failed to embrace individual enlightenment, and maybe together they could have kept the mythic age going. The Nephandi see reality as a lost cause. Mortals were given the chance to open reality, and they chose comfort in every case. Why should we care that the lambs bleat when slaughtered? And the traditions are bothered by everyone. I like this in that it provides not just a preface, but grudges. Coupled with a recent start to the Ascension conflict, this gives a lot of bitterness. Much like Travis Legg's Ascension truce idea, when a change in the balance of power has been recent, each group gets an additional internal cleavage along the lines of, do we accept and maximize the new order, or do we resist? The Ascension truce is Travis Legg's idea that the traditions and the technocracy need to join up to deal with everything else, and that there are a lot of tradition members and a lot of technocrats that probably wouldn't go for that new combined order to things. Do we continue doing fruitless raids on monthly technocratic symposia, or do we spend our time on targeted assassination, community organizing, or something else? Stepping out to the more cosmic scale, we find that the oracles are tied to spheres instead of merely being someone who chose to step back from Ascension. Their number may be fixed, and they operate 9 chantries, 1 for each sphere. The exact nature of the oracles is vague, and my first thought is that they are kind of like exemplars from Masters of the Art, entities who've foregone Arete to try and maximize their understanding and to merge with a sphere. Again, this is just an idea. See our episode on Masters of the Art for more information. We get the idea that the nature and dominion of a sphere is determined by the oracles, and I like the idea that maybe there are 5 oracles for each sphere. When one ascends, or one dies, or one is ejected from the ranks of the oracles, a new position opens, and the character and nature of a new oracle that steps into the role will shape the nature of a sphere. For instance, we get the idea later on that nuclear power is barred from the sphere of forces by the oracles of forces. Oracles may wage war on each other indirectly to have the largest remit possible, so that a reshuffling of their power could, say, move weather control from forces to entropy, as weather is a highly chaotic system. Maybe data overtakes correspondence when an NWO oracle takes the place of an ascendant oracle. Oracles can now be something like patron spirits, adding great insight into the working of a sphere in exchange for waging these proxy battles or expanding the understanding of a sphere in the world. Physics and chemistry could just have been driven by the agents of the oracles of forces and matter during a period where they were under technocratic control. We are also informed that oracles are who perform Gilgul, the destruction and shredding of an avatar. There's a few ways we could take this. Maybe only someone on the verge of ascending is capable of tearing apart an avatar without themselves being tainted. Maybe only they are impartial and impassionate enough to dispense this kind of justice. Maybe it requires knowledge beyond the spheres. We get the idea that the oracles have seen through the veil of focus, where most masters have gotten wrapped up in it. Masters think their paradigm is how the world truly works, where the oracles realize it's merely a framework to allow their will to change the world. I like this difference in that it lets every apprentice who knows about the oracles realize that no matter how powerful a master is, they're still not quite there. And this creates possibly this kind of U-shaped curve of understanding, where at the beginning someone is taking the rules and laws of magic and sees how open it is. They eventually get buried into a paradigm or way of seeing things, and only upon exiting the other side do they become an oracle. Maybe the oracles are considered in commune with avatars, granting unique insights, and what they do is more negotiate with the avatar and talk to it before it is unmade to prevent karmic backlash. Speaking of metaphysical journeys, Arete and Seekings are fundamentally different in first edition. Arete is the degree to which you've internalized that will and belief precede reality rather than flowing from it. This is a belief shared by all mages of the continuum, meaning that every mage in first edition is in on this being how magic works. They all get how things could work, but each has their specialties and preferred framework. Seekings are also different and highly tied to essence compared to future editions. Once the player has the required number of experience to increase their Arete, they tell their storyteller, that they're interested in increasing it, and the storyteller arranges for an epiphany, a powerful realization or an event that acts as the start of the seeking. The seeking takes place in the world rather than some abstract mindscape, and the character can see and interact with their avatar during this process. The avatar gives them a quest of some sort, ranging from protecting a node to changing a school curriculum to slaying an agent of entropy, or whatever would make sense regarding to the avatar's essence. The higher the Arete, the harder this task is going to be. I love the idea of seekings being real-world quests, and this explains why higher Arete is rare. If to get to Arete of 5, your avatar says, you need to bring down the government of Canada, or you need to discover a new element, that's going to be hard. I'm going to put that in the tough category, and is very much a case of needing to choose between enlightenment or the rest of your life. At a gaming table, this could be hard to balance, especially if the characters have opposing motives, so I can see maybe why it didn't stick around and was replaced just with this kind of mindscape idea. Let's talk a bit about the other factions in the Ascension War and what they looked like in First Edition. In First Edition, the belief that the world is round stems from mortal belief. Here, it's not the fact that they're scientists that make the technocracy the bad guys. It's that at every turn they chose the quote-unquote discoveries that gave them more power. They got rid of ether because it would have been an element that allowed movement beyond the earthly sphere, beyond the elect few the Void Engineers chose. They got rid of N-rays and orgone because it would have allowed mortals access to forms of power to improve their lives without the consent of the technocracy. 1E doesn't say that science is bad, but that if you are a scientist and at every point you expel the wondrous and ignore the fantastic, you're going to have a hollow life, and the technocracy represents the apex of this. Here, the fight of the virtual adepts in Society of Ether take on a new valence. The virtual adepts spit at the technocracy by going, oh yeah, you think technology is restrictive? Look what's going to happen when we show sleepers what computers can do. And they use this to create digital worlds that are beyond the control of the technocracy. The Etherites wage war directly on belief by working with discarded theories. The power in using discarded theories is that the belief is already there. When you invoke polywater or ectoplasm or Lamarckian evolution, those threads of, there was another way to do this, are already there. This is like using scraps from a munitions factory to forge the weapons to wage combat against the war machine that built the factory. The technocracy very much actively maintains the Gauntlet and Horizon, which means it probably needs some sort of infrastructure to do this. Part of this is likely psychic, by reminding mortals that there are no such things as ghosts, or that the Loch Ness Monster is merely a hoax. In some way, the Gauntlet is upheld. Your characters could thin the Gauntlet with a string of cryptid sightings. I like the idea of a group of mages using a Mothman costume to weaken unbelief so that Mothman can come through. The other half is there's probably some sort of active infrastructure. There are probably bits that your characters, if they want, can attack and destroy, or alternatively, need to be defended against Marauders and the Nephandi. Maybe the High-Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, or HARP, in Alaska is one such installation. Maybe every large telescope acts as a node in a network that protects Earth. What if mages go around damaging observatories to weaken the Gauntlet? Maybe the road network or the power grid are massive sigils that keep out terrible things. This technocracy is formed in the wake of two other ways of viewing magic. Wizards trained only a select few for their powerful magic, while the religious venerated only a narrow group of what they considered to be the saintly. Copernicus hated both, and in this alternative history, science was created to cut down the wizards and devenerate the saints. But the technocracy made the same mistake that everyone made before, enslaving humans to their personal view. Here, the game itself has a view on what is right. This technocracy is powerful and remote from the frontline hitmarks, hydras, which were progenitor supercreatures, the vat-grown men in black, killer satellites, and global surveillance networks. Here, the Syndicate is very concealed, and we are told that no known members are known by name. One interesting avenue listed is that the NWO follows paradox spirits and uses them to track down magic users. I just kind of like this. Symposia in this setting is a monthly in-person event held at a node somewhere in the world. Its location can be discovered and disrupted, and a common way to gain prestige as a young mage is to do some sort of raid on these. This is a very remote view of the technocracy. This is a small, elite group that is controlling a disproportionate amount of reality, but also suggests that your characters would have the ability to extend their power significantly with some planning and by getting sleepers kind of on board. This almost felt closer to like the Seers of the Throne and the Exarchs from Awakening, but I don't know enough about that game to really comment. The next group that's different are the Nephandi. They're beings that offered their souls in exchange for power, and are generals of the demon hordes that were purged from reality centuries ago. These hordes have reformed beyond Horizon. This immediately made me wonder, would it be like if demons across the gauntlet were greatly diminished? In the process of coming into our reality, unbelief begins to attack them. Killing a demon banishes it beyond Horizon, where it returns to a much more powerful form. Here it can parlay with Marauders and Nephandi and present a threat to world-walking mages. What if every demon that gets banished becomes something that can rival a master once you go beyond Horizon? One way the setting crept in is that demons don't like the taste of unawakened souls anymore. As all of humanity has lost youthful innocence, it just doesn't taste as good. Now they seek to bring down the gauntlet so that they can have access to earthly nodes. What if Nephandi nodes are directed out beyond the gauntlet to feed these spirits instead of being these strange sites of corruption gathered around calls? Mortal cultists with strange infernal powers or demons enthralled to Nephandic generals may be one of the threats against your chantry. The Nephandi are originally listed as aligned with the worm, but later there's much more talk of demon hordes and the worm is kind of de-emphasized. What if the Nephandi had a very narrow agenda, mixing in what we later get from Sorcerer's Crusade? What if demons had a very specific bone to pick with Islam, Christianity, and Buddhism, in the same way that the Jinn aren't particularly fond of the Tuftani and the Weavers? What strange alliances could this form? What weird power exchanges could they set up? See our episode on Infernalism, The Path of Screams, for more information about that particular aspect of the world of darkness. Next up are the Marauders. If a paradox spirit intrudes because you are brash, a marauder may be introduced because you're careless. Every time a mage uses a portal or passes beyond the gauntlet, there's a chance a marauder can get in. These are mages who have internalized the lesson that belief precedes worldview, but without the stabilizing force of paradigm. These mages are in close communion with their avatars, giving them the same agendas, and they wish to return to the high mythic age thinking that it was a time without rules. Even the text points out that the high mythic age had rules, they were just kinda different ones. Lacking paradigm or the steadying force of culture, they seemingly grow without morality. They're a little light on the ground in terms of what they do, but there are a few threads on how they act that I like. One of them is that they litter reality with talismans that sleepers can run into to be awakened to magic. These mortals may awaken without a framework and may be more likely to become a marauder themselves. So a game mission may be to go find these tainted talismans and find a way to destroy them, or to clean up the aftermath of when a mortal who may now be attuned with some slight access to magic becomes an actor in your local area. I also like that every time you run the Gauntlet of Horizon, a marauder may notice and may come in. Their presence perverts magic, although we don't get an idea of what that is like. I like the idea that your character may be able to hastily step sideways without using a ritual, but doing so represents a risk. Also, they indicate that every time a portal or gateway is used, once again, a marauder may notice and use this as a pathway back. This prevents portals and gateways from just kind of being free doors between the mundane world and some realm deep in the Umbra. The last awakened faction we get are those with a spontaneous gift. They are listed as orphans, and the only orphan group we get are the Hollow Ones. Anyone can grasp the tapestry and do magic, but it seems to be that having a framework will help ground you and prevent you from racing headlong into creating a warped reality, a la what a marauder is. Orphans seem to have pieced together their own way of doing magic, and my favorite theory is that they are mages who've received their magic not from a shard of the Pure Ones, but from something else, and this is listed as one of the theories mages in the world have. A marauder may view themselves as being the scion of another power banished from creation, and they may view spontaneous awakenings as similar characters aligned to this great other entity. Maybe they need to put together enough of them to make an offering to rend the gauntlet, or something similarly malefic. Alternatively, the spontaneously awakened may try to vie for a spot among the oracles to change the nature of the spheres. Moving on from the factions in the Ascension War, the 1E core gives us a bunch of information on the nature of magic. We're given the idea that reality emerges as 4 parts. First, there is quintessence. It is the substrate and fuel of all things. Next, there is pattern, where quintessence is divided into a form which cannot be seen but can be studied. through objects, whether they are physical or spiritual. The third step we have is a form generates a spirit, or an ephemeral incarnation. And finally, there is the physical reflection, which is created to reflect that spirit. The text indicates that there may be a fifth step or a fifth type of being, mind, which can believe itself into existence. And the idea of the Celestines or the Pure Ones or Gaia or the Triad being things that merely believe themselves into existence, I think is kind of interesting. This creates space for a cult of mages trying to incept an idea to create some sort of new Celestine to come onto the scene. This 5-step process gives us kind of a thing that mages can argue about and that they can all roughly see. Does Gaia manifest in quintessence, or is she the spirit of all things? Does the genius of a mage supply itself, or is the avatar somehow different? I think it's an interesting thing to work off of when there could be a shared framework that everyone could argue with. And that way, I find that a little bit more interesting than someone saying weather is controlled by weather spirits and someone else saying, no, it's a dynamical, chaotic system. We also get a few recurring magical ideas studied by masters and oracles, such as the correspondence point, the zero-dimensional object that contains all of space, or another big magical idea, the reincarnation manifesto, the idea that all objects and beings have a natural life cycle and they need to be followed. I'd love for the other spheres to have these. In the sphere section, we get little write-ups that say, this is a description of the sphere. This is how a master of the sphere, though, talks about it. Let's create more magical theories, more uber magical theories that mages argue over, like the time ocean instead of the time stream, the spirit monger's pledge and such. This universal explanation also informs some things that didn't make sense to me reading in later editions because they were one ideas that weren't carried forward. For instance, forces has a dichotomy between lesser and greater forces, which was never defined in future editions. Greater forces at Forces 4 include the nuclear, gravity, and the kinetic, although nuclear itself is barred again because of the oracles. Another one is Dispel Paradox at Prime 5, lets you get rid of a paradox spirit, which was much more vital in a game where paradox spirits was a primary way in which paradox was expressed. This creates little vestigial quirks within the game, and it's simply nice to know where they came from. Although the result in this scenario is that telekinesis using kinetic energy would now be Forces 4. The last thing I want to kind of bring back are just some of the other systems. People talk about how wild and freeform the 1E system was, as the rules were, it's coincidental if you can come up with an external explanation that someone would find reasonable. For instance, using matter to turn bullets into oxygen was coincidental because you could tell someone he failed to fully reload the gun. A person could Hulk out and flip a truck, and it would be coincidental because the explanation would be all the weight in the truck was on one side, and it was really easy to tip. The flip side was, if you did something vulgar, you could only roll dice up to your highest sphere rating of the spheres being used. So if you have Arete 6, and you're doing a vulgar forces effect, and you only have Forces 3, you get 3 dice. I don't see information on what to do for conjunctional effects when there's more than one sphere, as I could see that being min-maxed, but this is a not insubstantial cap. Also, this is a version of effects where it is strictly success or fail. For instance, if a character wants to do a post-hypnotic suggestion on someone to persist for the length of a story, that requires 4 successes. You need at least 1 for the effect to work, and 4 for it to last the story. Again, this is before damage and duration were a thing, so as successes grew, kind of the whole pool of size grew. If the mage rolls and gets 5 successes, and the target can negate 2 of those successes with willpower or counter magic, the effect simply fails. It doesn't end short, it's not partially potent, the effect just doesn't take effect. Counter magic is quite potent in this version, and I can kind of see why things like hit marks having premium could be pretty impressive. To me, this is now a game that promotes affecting someone's environment rather than maybe attacking them directly. Having a wall collapse on someone is harder to stop than a direct lightning attack. Difficulty near a node modified difficulties to between a -1 and a -5. Once again, nodes super important in first edition. Some other things in the system that just kind of are mentioned is that if you botch a willpower roll, you lose a dot of willpower. Repeating a failed effect can only be done by spending a point of willpower. Spirit didn't have a gauntlet rating, just a varying number of successes that you needed based on what would have been called a gauntlet rating. I like this as it doesn't let you use Spirit to suddenly reduce the difficulty of things if you're in an area with a low gauntlet. We generally get more details, like for Prime 3, that for each 5 points of quintessence you want to move, it costs a success. When astrally projecting, you move 500 miles per hour, which I don't think is actually said specifically in any later editions. It specifies that you need more successes for an effect to go further within your century range, which is something people still argue about, with 1 success being required for something to go to a distance of touch, or up to 5 successes for it to instantiate within your field of view. We also get neat little systems for realms. For instance, a realm may say Correspondence 4, and this is something that we also got in Book of Chantries. This means that anything up to that level is not just coincidental for that sphere, but mundane and automatically succeeds. That means realms with high ratings and spheres could be absolute boons to mages of the appropriate type. The book mentions the realms of the oracles may have a sphere rating of 8. Null B may have ratings of Matter 4, Prime 3. This would make it absolutely trivial to manufacture almost anything, as the advanced creation of Matter 4 is now mundane. This is the kind of system that makes it make sense to me why masters would leave Earth. A memory surgeon goes to a Mind 4 realm so that they can use their magic to explore and heal damaged psyches with no risk of paradox, which is something I assume is pretty bad to have happen when manipulating someone's mind or memory. In later rule sets, the Sanctum background is more powerful than even going into the Deep Umbra in terms of making magic easier. Why would you leave Earth and possibly disembody when you can just kind of have a Sanctum background? But now with this system, if you're a Life Master and you have access to a Life 5 realm, you can explore the sphere with literally no risk of paradox until you're an Archmaster. Now that's something that people would fight over and leave Earth for. There's also the idea of a negative rating. This suggests that mundane things now require magic. This is the tricky part. We don't get a lot of information on what this means. The example is that in a 2-dimensional realm named Flatland is Correspondence -4, meaning anything requiring a 3rd dimension, such as lifting or jumping, would require magic. Another listed property of the realm was Entropy -2. I'm not sure what this means, so we don't get an example. Maybe it could mean counting cards or doing something based on probability requires magic, or maybe generating chaos to distract someone requires magic. I would really want to work out what this means and make sure my table agreed on it. But this allows us to create very high magic realms, and also makes the realms in Book of Chantries make way more sense. I like the idea that you have your Kung Fu or Wuxia action realm that is forces -2 or 3. Using a gun can't be done. Maybe even bows don't work and you're stuck to simple melee weapons. I don't know, but I really like the idea. This brings me to the last bits from 1E. A few things that are never touched on again or that quickly change. Here, bygones are called mythic remnants. Before progenitor superhumans would eventually be called victors, here they are called superiors. The Arcanum was listed as having a tie through the White Monks to the Inquisition, rather than having been found in the 19th century. Pure forms were a sort of antimatter being that worked with the Nephandi that we get almost no information on. Figuring out what the Zigrogler were up to required an oracle. Each tradition had an ancestral chantry, kind of a central base of operations that nicely summarized its worldview and kind of concentrated its earthly power somewhere. Dewizatep had no leader, but there was this guy named Chiron that is trying to change things. And every rote seemingly had a thumbnail sketch of a mage and their worldview. That's right, one of the best NPC sections in Mage is the rote section of the 1E core rulebook. This continued on later, but not with this kind of density. The technocracy manufactured spiders that could hunt down nodes, and Nullby was a giant Victorian factory on a gray dull slab that was the base of operations for the technocracy. This is just walking through a few of the things that jumped out at me that changed over editions. If you enjoyed this walkthrough, I can try and do one on Book of Shadows, Book of Secrets, Book of Worlds, or Book of Madness, or some combination of those. I'll be running a poll, both on the Discord, discord.me/magethepodcast, as well as on the Spotify page for this episode where you can vote on this question. You can listen however you want, but Spotify just kind of has this poll feature built in. So that is it for me for this first episode of What We Lost, first edition Mage. Again, if you liked it, tell us. And if you didn't, we're interested too. I hope you found something to add to your game. This has been Mage the Podcast, where we'd never drop you between editions. This show is made possible by our executive producers, who are helping immensely as I build out a video studio in my basement. First, I'd like to recognize the oracles of the following bits of lore that never made it into first edition. Ben Bendlow, Oracle of technocrats who were unable to use magic on leap days or during Mardi Gras. Buck Gregory, Oracle of Traditionalists who were unable to use magic in phone booths or during Shark Week. Christopher Phillips, Oracle of the Nephandi originally selling tasks out of white vans to young Magi to try and corrupt them. Guy Stewart, Oracle of the Marauders, having always been able to be identified by the thin hum of Creedence Clearwater revival following them around. Jay Widener, Oracle of Mages not being able to join the Akashiana until they could show how they could get at least 11 katanas through an airport security check. Mikhail, Oracle of the Society of Ether, mostly being about Victorian dandies who liked inhalants. Pukaji, Oracle of Nodes being guarded by spirits who sounded like overworked librarians that sighed whenever you asked for quintessence. Sean Gallagher, Oracle of the Pure Ones being succeeded by the Impure Ones, followed by the Muddled Ones, and followed simply by us. The crew of Erebus, Oracle of the Demon Hordes being just Slayer fans. Jason Vines, Oracle of Inaki and just being Pig Latin. Derek Simsek, Oracle of the Oracles all working at Oracle. And Drawncap, Oracle of Mythic Remnants being not bygones but cast-off from tailors who made wizard cloaks, which could be used to make magically powerful blankets. Along with Archmaster Andrew Edelstein, Archmaster Brad the Blue, Archmaster Dan Svensson, Archmaster Leroy Bryce, Archmaster Morgan Aran, Archmaster Nathan Weaver, Alex, Alexia, Ambiversion, Anders S., Anand, Badurfi, Berto, Blaze Hibbert, Blake Ryan, Brandon, Bryce Perry, Bubba the Pale One, Chris Blake, Sinchotis, Sig, Daniel Cuppen, Daniel Scribner, Darren Hennessy, David McFall, David Roy, Dennis Osborne, Eli Levenger, Eric Schwenk, Fragger Rock, George Lara, Great Trillig H, Henry Kraft, Ia Bolt, Jason Duncan, Jason Kennedy, Jason W. Briggs, Jay Gatsby, Jeff Bryn, Jenna F., Jervis Johnson, John Magnuson, Jolyn Andes, Josh Heath, Joshua Hillerup, Lawson Stuff, Kathleen Halperin, Chris Fitzpatrick, Kevin Fitzpatrick, Chris Kinner, Leslie Weatherstone, Manel Canos, Matthew Prohl, Maurice Hopkins, Melissa Krause, Michael Creedle, Michael Parker, Nibero, Neil Patterson, Nikita Klamenov, Pax Cow, Patrick McNamara, Patrick Mulder, Rachel Grace, Ricardo, Richard Bat Brewster, Robart the Robot, Ryan Stray, Rob H., Ryan Kendi, Samuel Tobin, Sean Ryan King, Sev Nessus, Starfish, Stephen Carton, Steve Wynyard, That's Real Neato, Thrice Great, Tyler Bryan, Vincent Hamilton, Walter, William Connolly, William Martin, Wolf Larison, and our newest supporter, Will Vinson. Thanks for the support. Our EP shout out in this episode is to Sean Ryan King, and this is a weird one. I was going to do a list of famous kings named Sean. There really aren't any. Likewise, there aren't really any famous kings named Ryan. This is where I learned that the Irish had kind of three periods of kingship. The first was under the Anglo-Norman invasion in 1169. Prior to that, local kings called Arete ruled over small regions, or tuatha, meaning tribes. These kings could owe fealty to a more powerful king, and starting in the 5th century, the idea of a High King of Ireland emerged. A ceremonial ruler, generally from Tara, being the traditional seat of the High King, or the Eard Rina Héireann. After the Anglo-Norman invasion, kingship shrank in power until the flight of the Earls in 1607, when the O'Neills and O'Donnells fled Ireland after the defeat by the English, ending the Gaelic kingship system. Because nothing is ever easy, earlier Henry VIII had declared himself the King of Ireland, merging the English and the Irish crowns in the 16th century. So whenever I think of Gaelic kingship, I'll think of you, Sean Ryan. Rather listen on YouTube, search Mage the Podcast on YouTube to find our full library there. If you super like this episode or super didn't, drop us a line at magethepodcast@gmail.com or at Mage the Podcast on Twitter. We have a hop on Discord community at discord.me/magethepodcast. Also, if you like us, please give us a review on the platform of your choosing or tell a friend about us. Also go to magethepodcast.com for show notes and all of our previous shows. Now go change reality.